It's the week ending Saturday the 24th of July, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the lifting of all COVID restrictions in England, thousands fleeing their homes as massive floods hit China, and Brisbane being named as the host of the 2032 Olympics. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And as Olly mentioned, he's off on holiday, so I'll be here to unwrap the next few weeks with you. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin and the boss man, Holden Frith. Plus, from Money Week, it's John Stepek. But Kari, you're starting the show today. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Does a biological revolution bode ill for our well-being?
Nowadays, babies are routinely born by IVF. Organ transplants have become common, and cancer survival in the UK has roughly doubled in recent years. But all these achievements are nothing to what's coming. Progress in human biology is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. On the horizon now are entirely new ways of defining, screening and manipulating health, completely new ideas about cells, bacteria, diet, the human brain, and any number of ideas about how babies might be born. We are at the cusp of a revolution in virtually every aspect of human biology.
That was Daniel M. Davis, Professor of Immunology at the University of Manchester, speaking earlier this month. Kari, what's happened this week?
Well, this guy, Davis, he's just published a book called The Secret Body, which is all about, as we heard there, about how the new science of the human body is basically changing the way that we can treat health, that we can, try to prevent ill health, and also how it's going to change the way we live. And Davis has just published an article in The Guardian actually expanding on these themes about this revolution, as he calls it, in human biology. And he says we'll soon be exposed to all kinds of complicated information about the state of our health, including our personal level of risk for any number of illnesses, which, obviously that's going to mean big changes. But on the face of it, that sounds great. Personalised medicine. There's all these possibilities for intervention to control our health and to make the most of our cognitive and physical abilities. But, it's not that simple. In fact, it's anything but that simple. As Davis points out, because the human body is so finely tuned and just in a constant state of flux, a lot is going to come down to risks and probabilities, and these are very hard to act on. We've seen this with we've had just a taster of this with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've all had to make personal judgments about how to minimise our risk of catching the virus, and being bombarded with scientific data. But, in the future, we're going to have to process far more information and weigh up really complicated odds about a far greater range of health issues.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that feels like it has tendrils that will just stretch into absolutely every aspect of how we understand, not only our own health, but also healthcare. I mean, at its top level, what sorts of impacts will this make to the way that we treat illness?
Well, it's going to be much more focused, I think, on preventative medicine. But obviously, it's going to be down, the individual has to take some responsibility in terms of what treatments they have. Just to give one example off the top of my head, if genetic tests show that you're at risk of developing a certain cancer, say, within the next decade, at what odds do you go, okay, well, I'll take some medicine now as a precaution, or I'll undergo a preventative operation, but those, that drug or that operation can also carry risks. At what point do you go 1 in 4 chance, 1 in 6 chance? And we just don't have the knowledge to process all of this information. This is going to be stuff that is really complicated for specialists in biological fields, let alone for the layman to try to understand.
Holden, in his Guardian article, that's one of the really key and interesting components of what he's talking about, that he says that to equip us for all this new information, we're going to need to reach a new level of public understanding about exactly what Kari was saying earlier, risk and probability. But if there is one thing that we know about humans in general, it's that we're particularly bad at understanding probabilities in general. You look at the business of how people reacted to the AstraZeneca vaccine and the risk of blood clots. I mean, will all this new information just confuse us?
I think that's definitely a risk, or even that it there will be people will react to this information in different sorts of ways, and I think there's a good chance that it will end up making anxious people more anxious and fatalistic people more fatalistic. And that you can imagine that two people both being told they have a higher than average risk of having a heart attack, and one of those people will end up sort of purging their diet of anything that could be even potentially related to heart disease, and another person will think, well, I'm going to have a heart attack anyway, so chips from every meal from now on.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it, John, that we all know that smoking and drinking aren't good for us, but there's plenty of people who still do both of those things. I mean, is there the chance that even with all of this extra information, we're just going to default to the same kinds of behaviours and just keep doing what we're doing anyway because we like it?
I mean, I think definitely. I don't think that's undeniable. I do think that giving people more information is likely to shift behaviours in some ways. And I do think it's worth pointing out that these kinds of dilemmas for individuals are a current part of medical life and have been for ages. I mean, when I was a teenager, this is like 30 years ago now, I knew a woman whose sister and mother had both died of breast cancer, and she knew from that, even then, that meant she had an incredibly high chance of developing this particularly virulent form of breast cancer. And one decision that she had to think about was whether or not she was going to get a double mastectomy as a preventative measure. And obviously, there's the famous example of Angelina Jolie doing that. So this isn't especially new. The scale that we're talking about now is probably new. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of positive stuff obviously has come out of this. Immuno-oncology or cancer immunotherapy, where they basically train your immune system to tackle cancer cells, has already revolutionised the treatment of certain cancers just in the last 10 years. And this is all about personalised medicine and a greater understanding of biology. So it's one of these side effects where, I'm happy to have to worry about how people are going to take this, because the actual technological advances that are behind it are actually hugely beneficial.
Yeah, that story that you told there, John, I think is a really important point. That how much of this stuff do we actually want to know? Kari, if you think about the argument of people knowing when they're going to die, that, you may just end up spending the rest of your years worrying that you're going to develop the disease that you are, in some way genetically drawn towards. How much of this do you think people will want to know about themselves?
Well, I think this ties into another really interesting point about that Davis is making, that, the moral and ethical implications of this increased knowledge for the individual. If you decide, my odds of this, I'm just going to go with it. I'm not going to change everything. I'm not going to take this drug. And then you go on to develop that illness. Then are you to blame? Do you have a loss of sympathy? Conversely, if you decide, right, I'm going to do everything right, I'm going to live exactly as I'm told. Yeah, you might not get the illness, and you might not, you may live a full and healthy and happy life. But on the other hand, it may become rather joyless. The blurb of Davis's book says, imagine knowing years in advance the precise likelihood of developing specific cancers, blah-de-blah, following a diet and health regime tailored to your microbiome, continuous monitoring of your body's workings and well-being, taking drugs that improve your cognitive and health and help to acquire new skills, manipulating the genes of your unborn children, and so it goes on. God, it sounds hellish.
I agree that sounds like a nightmarish vision, but I wonder if the more likely negative side to what is, as we should remember, this is generally a positive story, but the more likely negative is probably not that we'll have these very specific information about, you will get this type of disease at this point in your life, but more that we end up with much vaguer sense of, you'll have a 15% higher chance of risk of this and a 20% lower chance of this. And so actually it then becomes a sort of barrage of information that we might not really be able to act on in any meaningful way. And possibly even that doctors could end up sort of outsourcing some of the decision making and some of the risk taking from their own shoulders and put it onto us to decide how we want to approach this sort of vast array of potential risks, when it, as we talked about, it's very difficult for most people to assess the potential upsides and downsides of treatment and the risk of side effects versus the advantage of going ahead with treatments.
Again, I am conscious that this is a positive, good news story, as you say, but, one of the other predictable negatives is that, if we are to be able to start viewing all illness as predictable, John, a doctor's going to face ever more lawsuits than even they do currently, because, we'll have in our minds the idea that they should have been able to see everything coming.
I do think that the structure of healthcare could be wildly impacted by this. And I mean, just globally. I mean, one thing actually that this reminds me of is the financial industry, strangely enough. But
Never could have guessed.
You're going to get 2008 in.
yeah, I was thinking I could squeeze the financial crisis in here. No, but so lots of people have got IFAs or financial advisors, and the financial advisor's basic job, if they're doing it well, is to manage risk on your behalf and interpret risk on your behalf, because that's what saving for the long term is all about. It's about getting the right mix of risk and reward. And in a way, listening to this, you start to think we're going to need the medical equivalent of personal IFAs. I mean, probably something like a superior kind of trainer to actually interpret all this data for us and, say this is what you should be eating, this is the type of exercise you should be doing. And I mean... Yeah,
I was thinking exactly the same thing when I read this story, that maybe, those sort of Bupa health assessments everyone will get, but in a much more sort of deluxe, regular updates. You go and see your health advisor once a week or once a month or whatever, and they tell you, right, this is where your state is at the moment, because obviously things are going to be constantly changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that could be positive. The tricky thing then is, I mean, this is just a persistent issue with healthcare. It's like what's the distributional aspects of that and the kind of controversies that will come about because of that. And I think Britain, to be fair, is in a particularly bad place in some ways to deal with that, because essentially we have a fairly politically infantile attitude towards the health service in this country, and that is neither I'm not being positive or negative about the NHS. I'm just saying we have essentially a kind of inability to discuss it in any kind of neutral way. And so that does worry me slightly, because we're going to have all of this personalised medicine, and the actual issue with making the most of it is going to be to do with the structure and the bureaucracy that it has to be filtered through, rather than the kind of more dystopia, or rather the other end of the dystopia, which is that somebody will give you a spreadsheet that says you have an 89% chance of developing, this type of cancer by the time you're 43.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Kari, how much of this sort of information do you personally crave? Do you own one of those Apple Watch health trackers? Do you want to have more information about your own health?
I have a Garmin tracker. I've just got one, actually. And I love it, but at the same time, I feel slightly enslaved by it. It's just like, don't always want to know. So yeah, I think overall, and again, this is a good news story, and overall, I welcome this knowledge. I think just what is really important is that we have the support to, as Davis makes this point, that we need the support to interpret all this data and to just deal with it and to reach our own decisions and then be at peace with them.
I think we probably also need a more sophisticated way of being able to opt in and opt out of specific types of information too. So not just saying I don't want to know anything or I want to know everything, but saying, maybe I only want to know things where I can take a course of action with it, or I only want to know things that are going to affect me or could affect me before I'm 70, or only want to know things that can affect me after I'm 70. Like just being able to kind of understand and really decide how we want to be told information about what may unfold during the rest of our lives in a way that I don't think we're really set up to do at the moment.
I mean, one of the things that we talk about on this podcast is the way that the stories that we pick are going to have impacts on our lives. And of course, the news this week is that there's a book out, and Davis is projecting forward to a future where we are going to have this information. I mean, how much further in the future are we talking about here?
I think we're already there to some extent. It's just going to accelerate. I mean, I was just reading up on some of these examples of these advances, and they are mind-blowing. I mean, just to give more of a sort of slightly more pedestrian-sounding one, analysis of gut microbiomes, essentially the bacteria found in our poo, is beginning to give up all sorts of information about our health. Like analysis of the microbiome in cancer patients can help predict their odds of a particular type of immune therapy working. I mean, this is happening now. It's just going to accelerate.
Yeah, it's a slightly thankless assignment having to be the poo scientist who is discovering that biome information. Well, for the ongoing health of this podcast, it's probably time to move on. John, I'm coming to you next after this. John, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Can central bankers really save the planet?
Thank you for mentioning climate change, because this has been a big push on my part to make sure that central banks, which are not the key drivers of that bus, actually does its part in fighting climate change. A limited part, not in the driver's seat, but its part. So we're going to do a few things. Number one, we're going to analyze in much more depth the impact of climate change and the impact of transitions by the corporate world and the impact of regulations, changes in the whole framework that will be decided by those who are in the driver's seat, governments and parliament. So we need to analyze that very carefully. We need to model that into our models. We need to anticipate all of that because it has an impact on the economy. Whether you look at inflation, whether you look at output, whether you look at cost structures, it has a significant impact.
European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde speaking to Bloomberg last week. John, what's she talking about and what's your story this week?
Well, actually this one, obviously that was Christine Lagarde of the ECB, but this week, or rather on Friday, the Bank of Japan basically came out and said that it's going to do something specific about propping up green businesses and moving towards a greener economy. And what that boils down to is that the Bank of Japan, which obviously prints a lot of money to buy government bonds like most other central banks around the world right now, says it will offer banks interest-free funds for climate-linked loans or investments. And the more of that they do, the more of their reserves it'll exempt from its negative interest rate. And to put that very simply, it means that it will stop penalising them for keeping money with the central bank. So basically it's incentivising high street banks to lend money to projects that are considered to be green.
And just before we go any deeper on this one, Holden, I wonder if you could just give us a quick Frithopedia primer on what a central bank actually is.
Yeah, so I suppose that the broad goal is to keep the economy running smoothly and ideally growing steadily without letting inflation run out of control. And so the main tool they generally use to do that has been interest rates, setting interest rates to ensure that enough loans and enough money is going into the economy to allow companies to grow, to let people get mortgages, but without too much going into it, so that the economy would overheat and inflation would start to run out of control.
And John, I gather from a column that I read of yours this week, you think that what's going on here is a bit of an overstepping of that traditional remit of what a central bank is meant to be for.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was an excellent primer for Holden about what central banks do. And you're absolutely right. Inflation tends to be at the heart of what central banks do. So the status of central banks has kind of shifted up and down over the years. I mean, basically, regardless of what anyone tells you, a central bank is an arm of the government. Now, they've had their independence. For example, the Bank of England has been independent since 1997. But this independence is, if you like, is something that is given by the government and could be taken away by the government. So if your independence is contingent, I don't tend to think of that as independence. But the whole point of trying to have this kind of like barrier between the central bank and the government is because basically there's two ways of affecting an economy. One's monetary policy, and that's what the central banks do, and one is fiscal policy, and that's what governments do. Fiscal policy involves taxing people and giving the money to other people. That's basically what it boils down to. So it's a distributional thing. Monetary policy involves putting more or less money into the economy overall. And that's with the specific target of keeping inflation at 2%. So you can see already there's quite a big difference there. On the one, monetary policy is, we've all agreed that the economy should basically going up the way, and that one way to do that is to keep inflation at roughly 2%. And you can argue whether that's economically correct or not, but that's a very neutral issue. Governments, on the other hand, say, oh, well, if you're kind of more left-wing, you say we should tax these people so we can give it to those people. If you're more right-wing, you should say we should not have as high taxes and then the money will trickle down or whatever. But the point is, it's a political choice. Now, the thing with the central banks starting to choose which industries should get a lower cost of funding is that's moving into a distributional policy. because, if a green company gets cheaper funding than another, that makes it more competitive, etc., etc. And that's where the difficulty comes in. And actually, you saw that with Christine Lagarde in that clip. She was at great pains to say that, look, we're not pushing this. We're not in the driving seat. But the problem is that it's yet another bit of mission creep for central banks, and we've seen a lot of that in recent years.
Kari, how has the US Federal Reserve reacted to all of this, and why do you think that the US doesn't necessarily always line up with Europe and Japan on these kinds of things?
I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that the key difference is it's easier the Bank of England have also been told to take green targets into account when looking at which corporate bonds to buy. And I think why it's easier for the Bank of England and the ECB to tackle climate change than it is for the Fed through these means is because there's wider political consensus in favour of reducing emissions. You need broader mandates. Broader mandates need broad political backing to be sustainable. And whereas, in Europe, there's general consensus that the climate crisis is a crisis. US Republicans particularly, there's a lot of skepticism about it. And the US Republicans have already accused the Fed of mission creep over the bank's, foray into social issues such as climate change. And, Jerome Powell said recently, he made very clear, he said, we do not seek to be climate policymakers. And that's true. And he has been very scathing of these moves by the Bank of Japan and co. But at the same time, the Fed is taking a slightly more active role in the climate change issue. It's set up 2 internal committees to explore the implications of climate change for the Fed's responsibilities in supervising and maintaining financial stability. And even that has just generated outrage among US Republicans. So, if the Fed actually then followed, went further and took these sort of similar policies to the Bank of Japan and co, then, there would be uproar.
John, I gather it's your feeling that central banks shouldn't be conducting what amounts to kind of industrial policy, in part at least, because they're unelected bodies. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Probably the other bigger issue is more that, central banks are getting landed with everything. So central banks were given the responsibility of bailing us out from I have squeezed it in, the 2008 financial crisis.
Yes, we made it.
So governments essentially just dodged the responsibility for dealing with that crisis and left it to central banks. And lots of central bankers, both at the time and increasingly now, have said, look, we cannot deal with this on our own. And yet, since the pandemic, they've been getting loaded down with more stuff. So now they've got to also sort out full employment. Actually, one reason, to be fair, that Jerome Powell is probably a bit squeamish about taking on climate change as well is because they've already just changed their mandate to emphasise getting more people into work. So the thing is, it's like it comes to the point, is there anything that they can't do? Actually, good example there was a Wall Street Journal piece about the Bank of Japan's decision. And at the end of the press conference, one reporter said to him, are you going to do anything about the gender pay gap and also about Japan's declining demographics? And Kuroda, who's the boss of the Bank of Japan, said, definitely not. And I'm like, well, actually, why not? If you're going to sort out climate change, you're going to maintain full employment, you're going to have an inflation target as well. Why don't you just take over the running of the economy? And that's the problem. It's like they were there for one purpose and they did that purpose quite well. But there's only so many things one department can juggle.
Yeah. Holden, there is a contrary view, of course, that central banks should have a role in tackling climate change. How does that argument go, and are you sympathetic to it?
I think the argument is that there's a risk that you end up with central banks pursuing a policy or at least enabling outcomes that are at odds with government policy. So where you have both political pressure from governments and also consumer pressure from customers to divest yourselves from fossil fuels or other environmentally harmful activities, the shares in those companies end up becoming cheaper because there's less demand for them. And so you then have other people sort of jumping in and buying them because they sense the chance of a bargain. And so I think the argument here is that by having a kind of systemic approach to to how expensive finance will be for these companies, you can kind of make the environmental cost of their activities more reflected in the asset price, and I can see the arguments in favour of having a kind of holistic approach to this problem. I think I do have some doubts about it, and I think that there are on some similar lines to what John's been saying, but also maybe slightly more political, really. I think the risk is that you end up having governments outsourcing difficult political decisions and therefore not actually having to make the arguments for them. And because they never deal with them head on, they never really win the argument. And so you have policies that feel like they're being enacted by stealth, really, without anyone being democratically accountable for them. And I think that's had negative effects in the past. I think there's even really a bit of a parallel here with immigration in the 2000s, 2010s, when British politicians essentially outsourced the decision over who should come into the country to the EU, and they would kind of grumble about it in public, while in private actually being quite happy with high immigration because it fueled growth and kept wages steady. But they never really made that argument in public because it was a difficult argument to make. And because nobody was arguing in favour of it, you had that kind of simmering resentment and blame that began to fester. And I think you could easily imagine the same thing happening with climate policy, because it will cause upheaval and there will be price rises. And unless you have political leaders standing up themselves and explaining why these changes are necessary, that same sort of powerlessness, resentment will set in again, because it feels as if it's just something that's happening without anyone having been consulted.
So, John, I mean, did you pick this story because you think that we're going to see more central banks following Japan here on environmental issues specifically? Or do you think that's not the way this is going to play out?
Well, I mean, we'll definitely see more central banks getting into this. What I think is interesting is that it's emblematic of, I mean, really what Holden said sums it up, and that was a really good kind of points that he made. It's basically politicians ducking responsibility for hard choices, and the problem is that that is precisely what led to the turmoil again post 2008, and also kind of the Brexit decision, because people feel that stuff's getting done and that they have no say in it, and it is important. It's things that affect things. It's not just something like, oh, should there be a bit more money in the economy this month or not? And the other issue is that central banks can be used as a fig leaf, and I think this is a bigger thing, because it goes back to what we said about independence before. They're nominally independent, but in reality they're not independent as soon as the government doesn't want them to be. And at the moment, governments have spent an awful lot of money, and there are an awful lot of pet projects that they would like to spend more money on. Some of those you'll agree with, some of those you won't. But the point is that all central banks are going to come under more pressure to fund those projects. And so the green stuff is uncontroversial outside of the US. But as you said, what if we start funding fossil fuel projects, or what if we start funding airports to nowhere or roads to nowhere, or all those kind of things, because a party gets into power and decides that we need a big infrastructure drive or something like that. So I think that's the bigger risk, that we just lose any illusion that central banks are independent and they start printing money to order for governments, basically.
All right. Holden, you're up next after this. All right, Holden, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why some hikers are taking the road less travelled.
I don't know, what's a good day in Scotland? A good day, I suppose, is finding the crag, finding a climb, finding a new route, finding something that really inspires you. I think now climbing in Scotland, for me, it's all about not knowing what it's going to be about. I'd rather go to somewhere where you have an idea that it's going to be in condition, something's going to be in condition, but you don't know what.
Nick Bullock from YouTube channel Mountain Equipment back in 2019. I'm not sure, John, that you agree with him necessarily that that's what a good day in Scotland looks like. But Holden, what's happened this week?
What's happened is that Mountaineering Scotland has warned hill walkers attempting to climb Ben Nevis that they shouldn't rely on Google Maps to guide them there. The problem seems to be that if you type Ben Nevis into your phone and request driving directions, it will lead you to the car park closest to the summit, which makes sense, but it will then show a dotted line all the way to the top. Google says this dotted line was never meant to be a walking route, but it does look a bit like one. And the problem, according to Mountaineering Scotland, is that this route, according to their safety advisor, goes through very steep, rocky and pathless terrain where even in good visibility it would be challenging to find a safe line. And she went on to say that in low cloud and rain, which is not unheard of in the Scottish Highlands, the suggested Google line is potentially fatal.
I mean, I can't think what that dotted line could be if it isn't the instructions on how to get to the summit of Ben Nevis. What is it meant to be?
It seems to be just showing the gap between the end of the available route you've requested and the point you tried to get to, but it has caused some confusion, it's fair to say, to the extent that the mountain rescue teams have had to put printed instructions in this car park saying do not follow this route to the summit. It is potentially dangerous, and yet people still have attempted to do so.
I mean, it's not just walking routes, though, is it? I mean, maps have often led people down the wrong sides of motorway slip roads or one-way streets. Is it actually possible, Kari, for these digital maps to ever be 100% reliable?
No, I think that's the danger. I think we think because it's on the internet, there's just this widespread assumption that it's correct and up to date, and sort of no lack of awareness that a lot of this information is crowdsourced, so it's not necessarily approved by experts. And in unfolding, say, emergency situations, it's not necessarily as up to date as you might expect. For example, during the 2017 wildfires in California, users were directed to neighborhoods that Google Maps had empty streets, and they were empty because they were on fire. So, that was a very hazardous situation. On the other hand, to be fair, Google subsequently launched a wildfire boundary map that crunches data from government agencies and Google Earth to update these things as quickly as possible. So I think the technology is improving all the time. It's just we need to be aware that it is flawed and it's not necessarily as fail-safe as we think.
I mean, maybe that's the thing that, obviously Google Maps doesn't expect for its users not to continue to apply their sensors in circumstances where, say, they're driving towards a massive fire, for example. And, I think back to the time that I was driving in Italy and I was following Google Maps' directions and I just went straight into a bog, which was definitely not my finest moment. But I blamed myself for that, And I sort of wonder, John, whether we're all becoming a bit too reliant on technology and allowing it to supersede our own good judgment.
I mean, hands up, I can barely find my way to my own front door without switching on Google Maps. I know it's getting the car to drive 15 minutes, I switch it on, drives my wife mad. She's like, it's the same road we've taken every day for the last 10 weeks. I know, but it might be something wrong with it.
Stay away from Ben Nevis.
Yeah, exactly. I'm ashamed to admit I have never been up Ben Nevis either. So anyway, that's my confession. You do. I mean, you have to use your common sense, and I don't think that's. I think that's inarguable, and again, I also think that it's astounding how far this technology has come. I mean, remember when GPS was a major feature that you had to buy and pay hundreds and hundreds of pounds for and then get updated because it didn't update itself, and now we've all got one on our kind of like basic smartphones. So again, it's one of these, there are no silver clouds without there's no silver linings without clouds kind of stories where it's like, wow, we have this amazing technology, how can we screw it up?
I mean, Holden, do you think tech companies at the very least need to be a bit more transparent about how they're offering their directional advice?
I think I would put the responsibility more on the users here. I mean, I think in some ways there used to be a little trick with Google Maps that if you typed in walking distance from, say, London to New York, it would suggest that you walked all the way to northwest Wales, I think it was, and then swim across the Atlantic and make landfall in Newfoundland. That I just checked that this week researching this story. It doesn't do that anymore, and I'm sure that's probably because some lawyer has told them that they cannot encourage people to swim across the Atlantic.
Or someone tried it.
Yeah. Quite
even
possibly.
more disturbing.
But I think it's just a useful reminder that we should probably be just a bit less certain about the information we're getting, not only from mapping software, but also just from the internet in general, or from any source. Frankly, it's if what you're being told by a digital device doesn't seem to square with what's in front of you in the real world, that's an important thing for debunking conspiracy theories, as well as avoiding kind of vertical cliff faces on your hiking trails.
I agree with Holden that the responsibility is ultimately with the user, but on the other hand, I think there are valid arguments that, for example, these mapping apps can make traffic worse if users all follow the same routes. You've got more than 1 billion drivers worldwide using mapping apps, and each app provider operates independently, using data streamed to its services only from devices of its users. So you've got multiple players working independently with imperfect information. And the dangers of this were illustrated really well by this last year, actually, by a performance artist who in Berlin, who basically dragged a handcart full of 99 smartphones down deserted streets in the city and generated false traffic jam alerts from Google Maps, because obviously these mapping apps show you the most direct route. On the other hand, again, to give Google its credit, it's taking a more green policy, in that it's just about to start showing eco-friendly driving routes to reduce carbon footprints, and it's launching this service is launching or this new feature is launching in the US later this year. So that would reduce traffic jams, presumably, as well as helping drivers to reduce their carbon footprints. So the tech companies are always trying to stay ahead, but it's not perfect.
I think that's the thing, that there are some obvious positives to this sort of technology. I mean, you think about, just at the most basic level, how many arguments this has saved between partners who are trying to, or friends who are trying to navigate from one place to another in, would have previously been flipping maps upside down and round and getting into terrible fights. And the question is, I mean, John, would you ever want to go back to a world without digital maps, even with their flaws?
No, definitely not. I mean, I was always terrible at reading maps anyway. And they mostly work. It's like you're kind of, it's that thing where you're balancing an atlas on your lap while you're trying to kind of, work out, oh, wait a minute, is it upside down or is it the other way about? And I guess I'm one of those people who needs to turn. I don't know why they talk about men having better spatial awareness than women, because I'm completely useless. So, yeah, no, definitely not.
Yeah, right. So, Holden, why does this story matter?
I think it is the point I touched on there about the sort of unwarranted certainty that sometimes having a smartphone in our hand that seems to have all of the world's information at its fingertips can give you. And particularly if you are used to, in the specific case of navigation, if you are used to using Google Maps either in as a pedestrian in a city or as a driver navigating your way through roads, it is incredibly useful and pretty much fail safe. But if you do get off the beaten track, you find yourself in territory where it just doesn't have the level of information that you might need, even if you do have enough battery power to get you through to the end of the route, and you do have enough signal all the way around. But even with those provisos, it can still be, I think, a useful technology to supplement other information. So if often if I'm walking off the beaten track and I have a paper map with me, I will often check that I am where I think I am using GPS if it's available, because it is really useful just to have that little blue dot that tells you exactly where you are, and you can then kind of tally that with the more detailed Ordnance Survey map you might have. But then I think what you have to avoid is being lulled into too much of a false sense of security, because occasionally that little blue dot will suddenly leap half a mile across the other side of a river,
and suddenly you're swimming your way across the Atlantic.
Yeah, and I think you have to maintain that healthy sense of doubt, which is for me at least part of the appeal of getting off the beaten track and trying to work out your way back onto it.
Well, I think we can park that for this week. My thanks to Holden, Kari and John for navigating us through this with absolutely no U-turns. Remember, you can follow this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And I'll be back again to unwrap next week. Until then, bye-bye.